"We do not serve people like you here," my daughter-in-law said loudly enough for every customer in the cafe to hear. And in that single moment, the cheerful sound of coffee grinders and quiet conversations disappeared beneath an uncomfortable silence. Nobody looked at their phones anymore. Nobody lifted another cup. Every pair of eyes slowly turned toward my wife, Margaret. She stood beside me, wearing her favorite light blue cardigan, the same one she had worn on countless Sunday afternoons because she always believed dressing neatly was a sign of respect for the people around you. She was holding a small menu with both hands, and for just a second I saw her fingers tighten around the edge of the paper. It was almost invisible, but after 43 years of marriage, I noticed the smallest changes in the woman I loved. Margaret did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at Claire with quiet confusion, as though she honestly believed she must have misunderstood what had just been said. I wish I could tell you that someone immediately stepped forward and defended her. I wish I could tell you that our son Ethan spoke first. Instead, he stood behind the counter wearing the expression of a man caught between two worlds, saying nothing while the seconds stretched into something that felt much longer. Claire folded her arms with complete confidence. She was managing the cafe that afternoon while the owner attended a business meeting across town. Over the past year, she had begun acting as though the place already belonged to her. She loved talking about modern branding, exclusive experiences, and attracting what she called the right customers. Margaret and I had only stopped by because Ethan invited us to see the renovations. He said everyone would be happy to show us how much the business had grown. We arrived carrying a small box of homemade oatmeal cookies Margaret had baked that morning. She always brought something when visiting family because that was simply who she was. Claire glanced briefly at the box before returning her attention to Margaret. "This is not really the atmosphere we are creating anymore," she said with a polished smile that somehow made her words feel even colder. "We have moved toward a more upscale image." Margaret looked down at the cookies and quietly asked, "Would you rather I take them home?" Claire gave a short laugh. "That would probably be best." Around us, customers exchanged uncertain glances. A young barista suddenly became very interested in arranging paper cups that were already perfectly stacked. An older couple sitting near the window lowered their voices until they stopped talking altogether. Nobody wanted to become involved, but everyone understood they had witnessed something deeply uncomfortable. I placed my hand gently on Margaret's shoulder. She looked at me and managed the same small smile she had worn through every difficult season of our lives. It was the smile she used whenever she wanted to reassure me, even while carrying her own disappointment. That smile hurt me far more than Claire's words. Margaret had spent decades opening her home to everyone. Birthdays, graduation parties, Thanksgiving dinners, neighborhood gatherings. She welcomed people without asking what they owned, how they dressed, or where they came from. Watching someone treat her as though she did not belong felt completely foreign to everything our family had once believed. Claire reached for the menu in Margaret's hands and placed it back on the hostess stand. "Perhaps another place would be a better fit," she said pleasantly. Ethan finally took one hesitant step forward, but before he could speak, Margaret gently touched my arm. "It is all right, George," she whispered. "Let us go." I nodded without saying a word. We turned toward the front door together, but just before Margaret stepped outside, she paused and looked back at the cafe. Her eyes did not show anger. They showed curiosity, as though she had suddenly noticed something no one else had seen. Then she quietly read the small sign hanging beside the entrance that displayed the name of the business, smiled almost imperceptibly, and walked into the afternoon sunlight. At that moment, everyone inside believed they had just watched an elderly couple leave in quiet embarrassment. None of them realized they had actually witnessed the beginning of a story that would change every life connected to that little cafe. We drove home without turning on the radio. Margaret rested the small box of oatmeal cookies on her lap exactly as she had carried it into the cafe, untouched from beginning to end. Every few minutes, she looked out the passenger window at the familiar streets passing by, but she never mentioned what had happened. That was one of the many things I admired about her. She never allowed a painful moment to steal her kindness. She believed dignity was something you carried with you, especially when someone else tried to take it away. After 43 years together, I knew silence did not mean weakness. Sometimes it simply meant she was thinking more carefully than everyone else in the room. When we pulled into our driveway, she climbed out of the car, adjusted the sleeves of her cardigan, and carried the cookies inside as though it had been an ordinary afternoon. Our home had never been extravagant. It was a comfortable brick house in a quiet neighborhood where we had lived for more than 3 decades. The front porch still held the rocking chairs we bought after Ethan graduated from high school. The maple tree in the yard had grown taller than the roof, and every autumn Margaret insisted on collecting a few colorful leaves to place in a glass bowl on the dining table because she believed little traditions made a house feel alive. She set the cookie box on the kitchen counter and reached automatically for the tea kettle. Making tea was her way of slowing the world whenever life became overwhelming. I watched her move through the kitchen with the same steady grace she had always carried. There was no bitterness in her expression, only quiet reflection. While the water heated, my mind wandered back through the years. Long before anyone knew her as Ethan's mother, Margaret had built a successful career in commercial real estate investment. She rarely talked about it because she never wanted money to define her. She preferred conversations about books, gardens, recipes, and family memories. Even after retiring, she continued reading financial reports over her morning coffee simply because. She enjoyed understanding how businesses grew or struggled. She had taught me years ago that every building held 2 stories. One was visible from the sidewalk. The other existed inside the balance sheets that very few people ever bothered to read. That lesson had stayed with me. We had been careful with our finances our entire lives. We saved instead of showing off. We invested instead of competing with neighbors. We drove dependable cars, paid our bills on time, and quietly built a life that never attracted attention. People often mistook simplicity for limitation. Margaret never corrected them. She once told me that being underestimated was sometimes a peaceful way to live. As she poured hot tea into 2 familiar mugs, I noticed something different in her eyes. The sadness from the cafe had not disappeared, but it had settled beneath a layer of calm determination I recognized immediately. I had seen that expression only a handful of times before. Once when we decided to rebuild after losing money during an economic downturn decades earlier. Again when she helped organize a community fundraiser after a local business closed unexpectedly. Margaret never reacted quickly. She observed, gathered information, and only then decided what needed to be done. She carried our tea into the living room and sat beside the large window overlooking the front yard. The late afternoon sunlight filled the room with a warm golden glow. Finally, she spoke. "George, did you notice the framed certificate near the entrance?" I looked at her curiously. "The business award?" She nodded. "And the small plaque beneath it?" I searched my memory before answering. I barely glanced at it. Margaret smiled faintly. It listed the ownership group. Claire may manage the cafe when the owner is away, but she does not own it. She lifted her teacup slowly before continuing. People who truly own successful businesses rarely speak to customers the way she did today. I listened without interrupting because I knew she was putting pieces together in her mind. She looked out the window once more and quietly added, "Something about that place did not feel as secure as everyone wanted it to appear." At that moment, I realized Margaret was no longer thinking about the humiliation we had experienced. She was thinking about the business itself, and whenever my wife began asking quiet questions instead of expressing hurt feelings, I had learned over 4 decades of marriage that something important was about to unfold. As the evening settled outside our living room window, I found myself thinking less about the words Claire had spoken and more about how naturally they had come to her. That was what troubled me most. Hurtful sentences rarely appear without a history behind them. They grow little by little until the person saying them no longer notices how deeply they affect everyone else. Looking back, I realized that afternoon at the cafe had not been an isolated moment. It was simply the first time her attitude had been displayed in front of strangers instead of family. During the first year after Ethan and Claire married, Margaret welcomed her with genuine affection. She invited her to Sunday dinners, shared family recipes, and even helped paint the nursery before our first grandchild was born. Claire always accepted the kindness politely, but there was an invisible distance that never seemed to disappear. She often described our home as charming in a way that sounded more like criticism than praise. She would suggest replacing antique furniture with modern pieces, recommend selling family keepsakes to create a cleaner look, and occasionally laugh about traditions she considered outdated. Margaret never argued. She simply smiled and said that every family found comfort in different things. At first, I believed it was nothing more than a difference in generations. Then the comments became more personal. One Christmas, Margaret carefully wrapped a handmade quilt she had spent months sewing for Claire. Instead of admiring the work, Claire thanked her politely before mentioning that handcrafted gifts were difficult to match with contemporary home decor. The quilt quietly disappeared into a closet and was never mentioned again. Margaret pretended not to notice. Later that evening, I found her folding leftover wrapping paper much more slowly than usual. When I asked whether she was disappointed, she answered with the same grace she always carried. Not everyone values the same things, George. I wanted to believe she was right. Another afternoon, Claire invited the family to lunch at a new restaurant downtown. Margaret arrived wearing a simple navy dress and her favorite pearl earrings, the same pair I had given her on our 25th wedding anniversary. Claire looked her up and down before smiling politely. You know, most people dress a little differently in places like this. Margaret quietly thanked her for the suggestion and changed the subject before anyone else felt uncomfortable. Ethan remained silent through the entire exchange, just as he had remained silent inside the cafe. Each time it happened, I told myself speaking up would only create unnecessary conflict. Looking back now, I understand that avoiding discomfort often allows disrespect to become a habit. Margaret, however, never changed who she was. Every birthday, she remembered everyone's favorite cake. Every holiday, she prepared extra food in case an unexpected guest arrived. She still mailed handwritten birthday cards instead of sending quick text messages because she believed people deserved to know someone had taken time to think about them. Those simple gestures never changed, even when appreciation became less common. That was why Claire's words affected me so deeply. They were not directed at a stranger. They were directed at a woman who had spent decades making every person around her feel welcome. I walked into the kitchen to refill my coffee and found Margaret sitting quietly with her tablet open beside her teacup. At first, I assumed she was reading the evening news, but then I noticed columns of financial information covering the screen. She looked up, smiled calmly, and said, "George, I think I finally understand why that cafe feels so different from the way Claire describes it." There was no anger in her voice, only thoughtful curiosity. After 43 years together, I knew exactly what that meant. My wife was no longer remembering what had happened. She was beginning to understand why it had happened, and that difference would soon change. Far more than anyone expected. The next morning, Margaret was already awake before sunrise, sitting at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad beside her tablet and a fresh cup of coffee growing cold as she read through page after page of public business records. I had seen that level of concentration many times throughout our marriage. Whenever she became completely absorbed in a problem, the outside world seemed to disappear. She was not searching for revenge. She was searching for facts. That difference mattered because Margaret had always believed decisions made from emotion rarely lasted, while decisions made from truth usually did. I sat across from her and quietly asked what she had discovered. Without looking away from the screen, she smiled and slid the tablet toward me. "The ownership records are exactly what I expected," she said. I looked down and saw a list of corporate filings, business registrations, and publicly available financial information. Most of it meant very little to me, but Margaret noticed every detail. She pointed towards several recent filings. "The cafe has changed ownership structures twice in less than 3 years. That usually means investors are trying to solve financial problems." She then pointed to another document. "The current owner also refinanced the property recently. Businesses that are thriving rarely need to make this many adjustments in such a short period." I leaned back thoughtfully. Suddenly, the polished appearance of the cafe seemed different in my memory. The expensive decorations, the carefully chosen furniture, the constant talk about creating an exclusive image now felt less like confidence and more like an attempt to hide uncertainty. Margaret quietly closed the tablet before speaking again. "George, appearances can become very expensive when they are used to replace good business decisions." I remembered how Claire had spoken about attracting only certain customers, as though hospitality could be measured by appearances instead of service. Margaret shook her head gently. "Successful businesses survive because they welcome people, not because they push them away." Later that afternoon, the telephone rang. Margaret answered with her usual calm voice, and I could tell immediately the conversation surprised her. After several minutes, she thanked the caller, wrote down a few notes, and carefully placed the notepad beside her coffee cup. "Who was that?" I asked. She smiled in quiet disbelief. "An old colleague from my commercial real estate days. We have not spoken in almost 10 years. She explained that he had recognized the name of the cafe when she casually mentioned it during an email exchanged the previous evening. He happened to know the current owner through a regional investment group. According to him, the owner had quietly begun exploring options to sell the business because rising costs and declining profits had become increasingly difficult to manage. The information was confidential enough that it had not become public knowledge, but experienced professionals inside the industry already understood what was happening. I looked at Margaret for a long moment before asking the question forming in my mind. "Do you think Claire knows?" Margaret slowly shook her head. "I doubt it. People often mistake managing a business for understanding its financial health." She folded her hands together and stared through the kitchen window toward our backyard, where the spring flowers she planted every year had just begun to bloom. "She believes she has control because she can decide who walks through the front door. She does not realize the real decisions are being made somewhere else." There was no satisfaction in her voice, only quiet observation. She never enjoyed seeing another person's mistakes. She simply understood that pride often prevented people from recognizing reality until it was almost too late. As the afternoon sunlight filled our kitchen, Margaret reached for her telephone once more. She scrolled through an old list of professional contacts before stopping at one familiar name. Without hesitation, she pressed the call button, and I suddenly realized that everything which had happened inside that cafe was about to move far beyond a family disagreement and into a world where preparation, patience, and experience mattered far more than appearances ever could. Margaret's call lasted less than 15 minutes, yet I could tell from the expression on her face that an important door had quietly opened. She thanked the person on the other end several times, ended the conversation, and carefully closed the notebook resting beside her. She never rushed into anything, especially when business decisions were involved. That patience had served her well throughout her career, and it was one of the reasons so many people had trusted her judgment over the years. I poured us each another cup of coffee and waited. Eventually, she looked up with the same calm smile I had seen after every major challenge we had faced together. "I have a meeting tomorrow morning," she said. "Nothing is certain yet, but I would like to understand the situation before making any assumptions." I nodded because I already knew she was not chasing an opportunity simply because of what had happened at the cafe. If that afternoon had never occurred, Margaret still would have approached the conversation exactly the same way. Facts always came before feelings. The following morning, we drove to a small office building on the other side of town, where one of Margaret's former colleagues now worked as a business advisor. The waiting area was quiet, filled with framed photographs of local businesses that had grown over the years. As we sat together, I noticed several familiar faces greeting Margaret with genuine warmth. They remembered her not as someone wealthy or influential, but as someone who had always treated clients honestly and respectfully. One gentleman shook her hand and laughed softly. "I have not seen you in years, Margaret, but I still remember you talking people out of risky investments when everyone else was chasing quick profits." She smiled modestly. "Slow decisions usually last longer." Those few words reminded me exactly why I admired her so much. Nearly an hour later, we met with the advisor inside a conference room overlooking downtown. He explained that the cafe had built an excellent reputation years earlier, but rising operating costs, management changes, and several expensive renovations had placed increasing pressure on the business. Customer traffic had become less consistent, and the current owner had quietly decided it might be time to sell if the right buyer appeared. Nothing about the situation sounded dramatic. It sounded realistic. Businesses succeed or struggle for many ordinary reasons, and pride rarely changes financial statements. Margaret listened far more than she spoke. She asked thoughtful questions about the lease, neighborhood growth, employee retention, and long-term operating costs. Not once did she mention Claire or our family. When the meeting ended, the advisor looked at Margaret and said, "If you are seriously interested, I can arrange a confidential conversation with the owner this week." She thanked him and promised only to review the information carefully. On the drive home, I finally asked the question I had been holding back all morning. "Are you thinking about buying the cafe?" She looked out the passenger window for a few seconds before answering. "I am thinking about whether the business deserves another chance." Her answer surprised me because it revealed exactly where her heart was. She was not focused on proving anyone wrong. She was thinking about the employees who depended on their jobs, the loyal customers who visited every week, and a neighborhood gathering place that had slowly lost its original purpose. A business should make people feel welcome, she said quietly. The moment it forgets that, it begins losing something much more valuable than revenue. Later that afternoon, Ethan called to apologize for remaining silent the previous day. Margaret accepted his apology with kindness, but did not mention the meeting or the possibility that was beginning to take shape. After the call ended, she placed a slim folder containing financial summaries onto the dining room table and carefully organized each document into neat stacks. I watched her work with quiet admiration because I realized she was preparing for something much larger than a family disagreement. She was preparing to make one of the most important decisions of her retirement, and somewhere across town, neither Claire nor anyone else had the slightest idea that the future of the little cafe was already beginning to change. 3 days later, Margaret received another telephone call, this time from the business advisor asking whether she would be available to meet the owner in person. She accepted without hesitation, although her voice remained as calm as it had been throughout every step of the process. Nothing about her suggested excitement or revenge. She simply believed that if she was going to consider such an important decision, she needed to understand the people behind the numbers as well as the numbers themselves. We arrived at a quiet conference room overlooking the small downtown district where the cafe had become a neighborhood gathering place years earlier. The owner, a gentleman named Richard, greeted Margaret warmly and thanked her for taking the time to meet. He explained that after nearly 2 decades of running the business, he wanted to retire and spend more time with his grandchildren. Rising costs, changing customer habits, and the demands of managing daily operations had convinced him that it was the right moment to find someone who could carry the cafe into its next chapter. Margaret listened carefully without interrupting. When Richard finished speaking, she asked questions that surprised even the advisor. She wanted to know how long the employees had worked there, which menu items customers remembered most fondly, and what traditions had helped the cafe become part of the neighborhood. Richard smiled for the first time during the meeting. Most buyers ask about equipment and profit margins first, he said. You asked about people. Margaret returned his smile. Businesses survive because people choose to return. The financial reports explain what happened yesterday. The customers decide what happens tomorrow. Richard slowly nodded, as though he had been hoping someone would say exactly that. They spent the next hour reviewing financial statements, maintenance records, supplier agreements, and future lease obligations. Margaret examined every page with the quiet confidence that came from decades of experience. Whenever she reached a conclusion, she explained her reasoning calmly instead of trying to impress anyone in the room. By the end of the meeting, Richard leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. I have spoken with several interested buyers, he admitted. Most wanted to change everything immediately. You are the first person who asked how to preserve what people already love. Margaret answered gently. Communities remember how a business makes them feel. That is worth protecting. Before we left, Richard asked one final question. If we can reach an agreement, what would be the first thing you change? Margaret thought for only a moment. Nothing on the first day except one simple expectation. Every customer who walks through the front door deserves the same welcome, whether they order a single cup of coffee or stay all afternoon. Richard smiled quietly. That was the answer I hoped to hear. As we walked back to the car, I asked Margaret whether she believed an agreement was likely. She looked toward the cafe standing only a few blocks away before answering. I think the business has a future if it remembers why it existed in the first place. Later that evening, Richard called to say he had accepted Margaret's offer, subject only to the final legal documents and customary closing process. The conversation was brief and professional. After hanging up, Margaret placed the telephone on the kitchen counter and simply looked at me with the same peaceful smile she had worn on the day we bought our first home together. It is official, she said softly. In a few days, if everything proceeds as expected, we will become the new owners. I looked at her for a long moment and realized that the woman who had quietly walked out of that cafe, carrying an untouched box of homemade cookies, was about to walk back through those same doors under entirely different circumstances. Yet knowing Margaret, I also knew her purpose had never changed. She was not returning to settle a score. She was returning to restore the kind of welcome that should have been there all along. The closing documents were signed on a quiet Thursday afternoon inside the attorney's office. There were no dramatic announcements, no celebration, and no audience. Margaret reviewed every page with the same careful attention she had given every important decision throughout our marriage. When the final signature was complete, Richard stood, shook her hand warmly, and smiled with visible relief. "I believe the cafe is in good hands," he said. Margaret thanked him sincerely. "You built something that became part of this neighborhood," she replied. "I intend to honor that." As we walked toward the parking lot, she carried a slim folder containing the finalized paperwork. It looked surprisingly ordinary considering how much had changed in just a few days. She glanced at me with a peaceful smile. "Ready to have some coffee?" she asked. I laughed softly because after everything that had happened, her first thought was still as simple as sharing an afternoon together. The following Monday morning we arrived at the cafe before opening hours. The familiar front windows reflected the early sunlight, and the smell of freshly ground coffee drifted through the entrance just as it always had. Inside, the employees gathered near the counter after receiving a brief message that the new ownership would be introduced before customers arrived. Ethan stood beside the espresso machine, looking both nervous and confused. Claire adjusted her blazer and glanced toward the front door several times, apparently expecting another investor or business executive to appear. When Richard stepped inside, everyone greeted him politely. He smiled, thanked the staff for their years of hard work, and then invited Margaret and me to join him near the front counter. For a moment the room became perfectly still. Claire looked at Margaret, then at Richard, then back again as though trying to understand what she was seeing. Richard spoke calmly. "I want to introduce the new owner of the cafe. After careful consideration, I have officially transferred ownership to Margaret Whitaker." The words seemed to hang in the air. Ethan's eyes widened with complete surprise. Claire remained motionless, unable to hide her disbelief. Several employees exchanged uncertain glances before slowly smiling. Richard continued speaking, explaining that he had chosen someone who valued both the business and the people who made it successful. When he finished, he handed Margaret a small ring of office keys. She accepted them with quiet gratitude before turning toward the staff. "Thank you for welcoming us this morning," she began. "I know unexpected changes can create uncertainty, so I want to share one thing immediately. Every person working here deserves respect, and every customer walking through these doors deserves the same welcome regardless of age, appearance, or background. That expectation begins with me, and it applies equally to everyone, including myself." No one interrupted. Her voice remained calm, yet every word carried unmistakable conviction. She did not mention what had happened days earlier. She did not look toward Claire while speaking. She simply described the kind of place she hoped the cafe would become. Ethan slowly stepped forward. "Mom," he said quietly, "I had no idea." Margaret smiled gently. "You did not need to know. Today is about moving forward, not looking backward." Claire finally found her voice. She looked down briefly before meeting Margaret's eyes. "I owe you an apology," she said softly. "Not because you own the cafe now, but because I should never have spoken to you the way I did." The room remained silent. Margaret nodded respectfully. "Thank you for saying that." She paused before continuing. "The best apology is shown by the way we treat people from this day forward." Claire lowered her head in quiet agreement. There was no anger left in the room, only the unmistakable feeling that something important had changed. As the first customers began walking through the front door a few minutes later, Margaret greeted each one with the same warm smile she had offered people her entire life. And watching those ordinary moments unfold, I realized that true leadership was never about proving someone wrong. It was about creating a place where no one would ever hear those painful words again. The first few weeks passed more quietly than anyone expected. Margaret resisted every suggestion to make dramatic changes simply because she was now the owner. She believed people needed stability before they needed innovation. The familiar menu remained the same. The old wooden tables stayed where customers remembered them. The neighborhood bulletin board near the entrance was cleaned and updated instead of being removed. Fresh flowers appeared on each table every Monday morning because Margaret said small details reminded people they mattered. The employees gradually relaxed as they realized they were not expected to become different people overnight. Instead, They were encouraged to greet every customer with patience, learn regular visitors' names, and take genuine pride in making the cafe feel welcoming again. I often sat near the front window with a newspaper and a cup of coffee, quietly watching the atmosphere change one ordinary conversation at a time. It was remarkable how quickly kindness could spread once someone chose to practice it consistently. Customers lingered longer. Conversations became warmer. Several people who had stopped visiting months earlier quietly returned after hearing from friends that something felt different about the place. Margaret never claimed credit for any of it. Whenever someone complimented the improvements, she simply smiled and thanked the employees standing behind the counter. She always insisted that a business earned its reputation one interaction at a time. Ethan seemed determined to rebuild the trust he had lost. He arrived early every morning, stayed late whenever extra work needed to be finished, and made a point of speaking with every employee instead of remaining hidden in the office. One afternoon, he walked over to my table during a slower hour and admitted something that had clearly been weighing on him. "Dad, I spent so much time trying to avoid conflict that I forgot silence can become its own decision." I folded my newspaper and looked at him carefully. Recognizing that as the first step, I answered, "The second is making sure it never happens again." He nodded without defending himself. That simple willingness to accept responsibility reminded me of the thoughtful young man Margaret and I had raised. Claire's changes came more gradually, and perhaps that made them more believable. She did not suddenly become a different person. Instead, she began paying attention in ways she never had before. I noticed her carrying drinks to elderly customers without being asked, taking extra time to explain menu options to visitors, and thanking the kitchen staff at the end of each shift. The polished confidence she once displayed had softened into genuine professionalism. One afternoon, an older gentleman accidentally spilled his coffee near the front counter. Before anyone else could move, Claire hurried over with fresh napkins and another cup prepared at no charge. She smiled warmly and told him not to worry because accidents happen to everyone. As I watched the scene unfold, I remembered the woman who had once judged people before they even sat down. The difference was not perfection. It was humility. Later that evening, after the last customer had left, Margaret invited the entire staff to stay for a few minutes. She thanked them for embracing the new direction of the cafe and then surprised everyone by placing the untouched box of homemade oatmeal cookies on the center table. She had kept it in our freezer ever since the afternoon we walked out of the cafe together. Earlier that morning, she had baked a fresh batch using the same family recipe. "I wanted these cookies to remind us of something," she said gently. "A business is never remembered because it made people feel unwelcome. It is remembered because someone walked through the door and felt like they belonged." Claire quietly looked down before reaching for one of the cookies. Her eyes filled with emotion as she whispered, "Thank you for giving me another chance." Margaret smiled with the same kindness she had offered people her entire life. Second chances become meaningful only when we choose to honor them every day. Looking around the cafe that evening, I realized the greatest transformation had never been about ownership. It had been about restoring the simple belief that every person who entered through those front doors deserved to be treated with equal dignity and respect. Several months passed before I fully understood how much a single afternoon could change the direction of an entire family. The cafe had become busier than it had been in years, not because of expensive advertising or dramatic renovations, but because people genuinely enjoyed spending time there again. Familiar faces returned every week, bringing friends, neighbors, and relatives who quickly became regular customers themselves. The bulletin board near the entrance filled with announcements for local charity events, school concerts, and neighborhood gatherings. Fresh flowers still appeared on every table each Monday morning, and the homemade oatmeal cookies Margaret baked had quietly become one of the cafe's most requested treats. Customers often asked about the recipe, and she would simply smile and tell them that the most important ingredient could never be measured in a mixing bowl. It was kindness. Ethan continued earning back the trust he had nearly lost, not through promises, but through consistent actions. He greeted customers by name, thanked employees at the end of every shift, and never again allowed uncomfortable moments to pass without speaking with honesty and respect. Watching him grow into that responsibility reminded me that people are capable of changing when they choose humility over pride. Claire changed as well, although not overnight. She still possessed the confidence that had once made her successful, but it was now balanced by something far more valuable. She had learned to listen before speaking and to understand people before judging them. One afternoon, I watched her welcome an elderly couple who hesitated at the entrance because they thought the cafe looked too fashionable for them. Claire walked over with a warm smile, held the door open, and invited them to choose any table they liked. She even carried their drinks to them personally before spending several minutes talking about the homemade desserts Margaret had prepared that morning. As I observed the conversation from my usual seat near the front window, I realized Claire was offering those strangers exactly the welcome she had once denied my wife. That quiet moment meant more than any apology ever could. Later that evening, our family gathered for dinner at our home, just as we had done for decades. The dining table was filled with familiar recipes, comfortable laughter, and stories that wandered from childhood memories to future plans. Before dessert, Ethan stood and gently tapped his glass. He looked toward Margaret before speaking. "Mom, I spent a long time believing success came from impressing people. You taught me that real success comes from making people feel respected." The room fell silent, but this time the silence carried gratitude instead of discomfort. Claire reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. "Thank you for believing people can become better than their worst moments," she said quietly. Margaret smiled with the same gentle warmth that had carried our family through every season of life. "Every family writes its story one choice at a time," she answered. "The important thing is deciding that the next chapter will be better than the last." As I looked around the table, I thought back to the afternoon we quietly walked out of that little cafe carrying an untouched box of homemade cookies. At the time, everyone believed Margaret had been dismissed because she did not belong. The truth was very different. She had never needed anyone's permission to belong. Character, dignity, and kindness are not given by a business, a title, or another person's opinion. They are carried within us every single day. Looking back now, I rarely think about the painful words that once echoed through that cafe. I remember something far more important. I remember watching my wife choose wisdom instead of anger, patience instead of pride, and compassion instead of revenge. Those choices changed a business, healed a family, and reminded every one of us that the strongest people are often the quietest. In the end, the greatest victory was never becoming the owner of a neighborhood cafe. It was proving that every person deserves to be welcomed with respect, because a place built on kindness will always leave a stronger legacy than one built on judgment.